trying to impart through this program is really the importance of leadership and the understanding of what corporate leadership is about. So I use the P for pilotage, or pilots are leaders, and that is a significant component in the program. And time again, we're going to hear the significance and the importance of leadership in creating excellence.
Quality management places a premium on people, It's kind of ironic. In a lot of corporations, I think people spend more time thinking about the equipment than the people, And quality management seems to indicate that people are the most important resource.
Now, what decisions, could I ask myself, were made in the post office about future generations? We were about survival. It was the government on our backs. They wanted to privatise us in the mid-90s, and we had to actually increase profit to the detriment of our staff and probably to the detriment of our customers.
They are unable to solve equations with more than 4 or 5 variables, non-linear, with mathematical tools. It's impossible. So we must solve the problem with the systems view.
The middle management is very critical in successful implementation of the system. The major difficulty to overcome their resistance. The most effective way is to get them involved.
Different places have different definitions of quality. And the reason the definition varies is dependent upon the current understanding of what is TQM. It's widely varying from place to place. Current status of business and quality management practices. And finally, differences in socio-economic conditions or environment in a particular society.
And tonight I'm going to be able to funnel down through the visionary leadership coming up the stream from the government itself, what I'm going to show you right now, how the visionary made Dubai, and then going down to a specific example when we put all the principles of the quality management into action.
And because of its move towards a more of a business excellence approach in terms of the standard, then I think worldwide more organisations now understand what business excellence is and can hopefully improve their competitiveness.
We need to seek perfection. So the measure of success ultimately is going to be a measure of quality or a measure of what I call perfection. It might be an elusive concept, but we need to have it in mind. We need to have stretch goals towards perfection. We need to have our distinctiveness, our distinction. That is the true differentiating factor between excellence and average. And the distinctiveness really is the mark of excellence. And the mark of excellence is about having quality as the penultimate measure.
So, first of all, thanks to Neelam and Mohammed for inviting me here. It's always a privilege to talk to students and to give a perspective. Interesting title, this, Sustaining Excellence, a European Perspective. I seem to be an amalgam of several weeks of your schedule here. I don't know what's gone before, but you've sure got a lot to read, so good luck with that. I'll say a little bit more about how I came to be here, really, because my connection with total quality management and business excellence goes back a bit further than my current role in Sheffield Hallam University and my connections with the European Foundation for Quality Management. I actually, I'm in my second career. My first career was with the British Post Office, Royal Mail, and I used to visit Bradford, actually over a number of years in different roles. When I first started coming here in the late 70s, early 80s, it was as a regional marketing manager for Royal Mail North East, where my job was to liaise as an account executive for the large mail order companies here, Grattan's and Empire Stores. And I suppose that was pretty pioneering work because in those days, the post office was only just getting into marketing. Marketing was just, something that you read in textbooks. But we started developing an approach to marketing post office services. And it was quite interesting to see the way the mail order companies grew in the 80s and the 90s. Well, now, like everything, they seem to be in some sort of decline. In the late 80s, the post office was going through a crisis. It seems to always be in crisis. You've probably read in the papers about its most recent crises. But the crisis was one, again, of customer confidence, of government confidence, of rising costs and falling quality. And we decided in 1988 to implement a total quality management program which was badged customer first. And I was very fortunate because I picked up these title, total quality management, when I was on a training program, leadership training program, and started asking some questions. And the next thing I knew, I was on a national reference group, which was working with a nationally appointed quality director to devise a program for implementing total quality management. And subsequently, as a district manager in Sheffield, I was responsible for implementing a total quality management program in Sheffield. And then in about 1992, I became Director of Quality, subsequently Director of Business Excellence and Planning for Royal Mail North East. So I suppose I'm drawing down from some experience of working with quite a large organisation. I mean, when we started off on the Customer First programme, we had about 180,000 employees. In my division, in Royal Mail North East, when I was Quality Director, we had almost 20,000 employees. So, you know, there are some big issues about how you deploy a total quality management approach across a large organisation. But having got sort of a taste for the European connection, because in 1992 the Post Office adopted the excellence model as a way of working. It was a framework that described a way of working. I was fortunate to be seconded to the European Foundation for Quality Management in Brussels, where between 97 and 99, I was responsible for promoting this excellence model to Europe, and that's the connection with the Cabinet Office that had actually adopted the excellence model for the public sector to promote benchmarking and the sharing of good practice. So, you know, if this is about best practice management, then what I'm going to be covering, only in a superficial outline tonight, because I've only got an hour, is the approach that you can use something like a framework, which is called the European, the EFQM Excellence Model, as a way of stimulating sharing good practice, benchmarking, and learning about how to improve organisations. So how did I end up in education? Because here I am, Sheffield Hallam University, and it was a most unlikely situation. I never thought I would actually end up as a senior manager in a university. But the university that I joined had actually set a goal of implementing the excellence model. The Vice-Chancellor, in true leadership style, had stood up and said, this is what I want to do. And for the first 3 or 4 years, I worked to implement the excellence model in Sheffield Hallam, but learnt that the only way to get on in higher education is to beg for money. And you beg for money by getting projects. And I was fortunate to set a project up, which has now been continuing for almost 6 years, which has been working with Durham, Cranfield, now the University of Chester and Central Lancashire to look at ways in which we can improve the organisational effectiveness of higher education. And I say, you know, that is really quite challenging stuff. You know, actually more challenging really in cultural terms than the Post Office. And here I am, you know, found myself, well, the next way to get on in higher education is you've got to get your own centre. You know, you've got a centre here, Mohammed runs, gives you a bit of independence, gives you a focus. So I became a business unit, first of all within central administration. Now I've joined the Faculty of Organisation and Management. And we're actually looking at not just the excellence model, but we're actually looking at something called integral thinking. So we're going to touch on that, and it might be a spark for you to actually look at some other ways of thinking, because, you know, I think we need it these days. The global conditions are pretty tough. The other point about my current position is that next week I join you as a student, not here, but as a student at Sheffield Hallam University. I've been invited to go on the DBA course, Doctorate in Business Administration. So I'm actually going to go back to school, as it were, and it's a taught programme, so I'm going to get some, you know, bringing fully up to speed with current management thinking. But my focus of a final sort of research dissertation will be on the application of integral thinking to cultural transformation. So, you know, wish me luck as a student. It's going to be quite interesting. You know, I'm working with people in the faculty who are, you know, like me, heads of centre, who will be my tutors. So an interesting dynamic there. So you've got some slide notes here. which I hope will do justice to it. At the end, there are some fairly comprehensive references. So as we go through, I know because you've got to write big essays, 3,000-word essays. Mine is 7,000, by the way. Eh? Oh, that's even more then. So 3,500 minus 7,000. I've got to do 2 this year. So we're all in the same boat. And you've got some really good stuff. I've got about twice as much as this to read by Monday as pre-work, but it's good. It's really interesting. So I'm going to then really, in terms of the context for this talk this evening as a guest speaker, focus really on this thing called best practice management, in the sense I'm going to share with you some of my experiences, and I suppose your task is to see whether or not any of these are adoptable in your own context. So benchmarking was always about, you go out and you look at what's good, you benchmark a process, you benchmark a practice, you start to adopt it, but then you have to adapt it within the organisation that you work for. The context then is sustaining excellence, and one of the things that we might dwell on is what is meant by sustaining, sustainable, and so on, with I suppose, a background of having worked with the excellence model, which is a European model of excellence, which, if you've done some of the pre-work, you'll know sits alongside Baldrige and the Japanese Deming Prize as global models of excellence. The European perspective is to say, well, some of this stuff is actually going off in Europe. But the question to you is, what's different between Europe, Japan, the US, and all the other places that you're looking at here? I think the differences are very marked when you get to India, the Middle East, Hong Kong. But certainly there's a lot of similarities in approach in these so-called Western countries, like areas like Europe, USA, and so on. And I suppose the idea is to check whether all this is transferable. Does the US stuff transfer into the European culture? Does the Japanese stuff transfer into the European culture? But what about all of this? How does it go into Middle East? How does it go into the Far East? How does it go into China? That would be something that you could discuss in your tutorial groups. What I thought I'd do now is just to set the context with a change of technology, because I've got something here which we could share. Now this needs the light down slightly, which gives me a chance to sort of work the technology out. This is an extract from a video from EFQM, which was as a sort of a trailer for the big EFQM conference last October.
Dawn on the 1st of January 2000. A new day, a new year, a new century, a new millennium. The future beckoned, and the peoples of the world responded with optimism. Nowhere was that optimism stronger or more infectious than in the world of business. After that last decade of the 20th century, with its sustained growth and rapidly evolving technologies, we thought we could do anything. Halfway through that new decade, hope for the future remains, but confidence has been shaken. Bubbles have burst, stock markets have halved, and giant corporations which seemed invincible have been blown away. Recovery is a slower process than collapse, and business people may wonder if things will ever be what they were. The answer is no. The future is never the same as the past. It is always different. Who can tell what the business environment will be like in 2010, 2015? Which of us would dare to boast of 2020 vision? Some of the challenges of the next 5 to 10 years can be clearly identified. China. China, with its teeming population, industrialized, mechanized, urbanized, in a breathtakingly short period of years. Is she a threat or an opportunity for European business? How should Europe respond to the challenge of Asia and undeveloped countries that won't stay undeveloped for long? Coming years will see continuous change in technology, manufacture and design. For 25 years, quality in Europe has been supply side. Get it right first time, every time. Give the customers what they want. Satisfy him, delight her. But in the years ahead, the customer will have a seemingly endless choice of products and services where supply-side quality can be taken for granted. What will be the rationale for customer choice and selection? And how must your business change to make sure that you are not rejected? After the shocks and scandals of the infant 21st century, will there be a new transparency and emphasis on good corporate governance? What will be the new way of doing business in an environment of tighter legislation and a global economy where business will increasingly be held accountable for the impact it makes on the natural environment? In October 2005, the EFQM Forum will be held in Cardiff, capital of Wales, which is one of Europe's oldest and smallest nations. And Cardiff is Europe's youngest capital. Cardiff sets European business an example. The city has been changing in order to prosper in a future that it recognizes will be different from what has gone before. Cardiff Docks has become Cardiff Bay. What was once the busiest and biggest coal port in the world has been transformed in the most radical and extensive waterside regeneration in Europe for 40 years. The new Millennium Stadium, a sports arena at the leading edge of stadium technology, where the European Award Gala dinner will be held, and the brand new Millennium Centre for the Arts and Opera are making the city a sporting and cultural destination on the European map. But in October 2005, Cardiff is the destination for Europe's business community. They will come to Wales because they want to be confident about the future. All those specific identified challenges will be specifically addressed. They will come to hear about the new quality in the context of a new global competitiveness. Cardiff, October 2005. What's next for European business?
Okay, so that sets the context. I mean, it is a challenging environment that we face. And I suppose the challenge to you as MBA students and other master students is that you're going to go into organisations which will be facing these challenges of sustainability well into, the next 2 or 3 decades. So what sort of principles and practices will you take in? And what sort of role will you have as leaders, you know, in senior positions in these organisations, maybe 5, 10, 15 years' time? Because there are some important issues to actually face up to. So, you know, we're going to be looking at sustaining excellence. So, I mean, the first word to define is, you know, what do you mean by excellence? I mean, who'd like to offer a definition of excellence? This is a question to the students, actually. This is where you have to do a bit. Surely there's got to be some interactivity. Definitions of excellence. So we're talking about maybe in an organisational context. What would be excellence in an organisation that you currently work in? Yeah. Yes, or expectations of what? Yeah. Who sets these expectations?
Excellence is being market leaders.
Market leaders, yeah. Yeah. Where does it fit then with expectations?
Customer sets the expectations. So
Yeah.
from excellence, it's when the expectations of the customer are
Yeah. So what would be another example of a stakeholder then?
customers, society, environment,
Yeah.
suppliers,
Yeah. So already it's getting pretty complex then. So excellent. So I mean, one of the first things that I normally do when I work with the excellence model with organisations, and at the moment it's primarily higher education teams in departments, faculties, or for the university centre, is to say, well, what does excellence mean for you in your context? And we come to it by actually mapping what the stakeholders are. And the stakeholders certainly are customers and you need to understand their needs and expectations. But, you know, there are others. There's the suppliers. There's the staff in the organisation. There's the shareholders. In the public sector, you've got funding providers and regulatory bodies. And in the context of all organisations now, we have society. Now, what is society? You know, and I'm just going through with a team in Sheffield Hallam. It's Learning Centre and the information systems people came together. And they're looking at the excellence model and they say, well, why should we want to bother about society? Which is an interesting viewpoint. There's a very narrow, introverted viewpoint. So the first thing, excellence is a tricky thing to define, but it seems to be about doing things which, you know, are going to be better than you've done before. Seems to imply some sort of improvement. Now, when I was in Royal Mail, we used this as a definition of excellence. It was a way of working. It was almost a philosophical approach to the way we ran the organisation. And it was to look, as you've described, the balanced stakeholder set and to achieve balanced stakeholder satisfaction. And in some organisations, you know, the customer mix is very complex. In a higher education context, you know, you are clearly seen as customers, but I have debates in academic circles is why should we call the student a customer? You know, this isn't Marks and Spencer's, but you have needs and expectations, you have requirements for your learning, and even, when was it, yesterday in the Times Oxford front page saying that they're actually going to produce service level agreements, so their students have to sign this in agreeing a certain way of working. Now, I don't know whether that's fair or not on the students, but, you know, they've got to go to the lectures rather than punting on the river. And they've got to do the tutorial stuff as well, because there's going to be litigation as students become more and more consumer-oriented. I mean, you guys can start taking the university to court if you don't think you're actually getting value for money. I mean, we are wising up, certainly, to the need to embrace the full set of needs and expectations of our student. And that's something which our Vice-Chancellor came in with as one of the areas of developing a new ethos.
Well, with Oxford, which is what you're quoting from, they did that because they had an increase of 30% in the tuition cost.
Yes.
And they were trying to justify that tuition cost to their students because their students were having a problem with the dramatic increase
Yes.
at a one-time interval.
Yes.
So they already saw the litigation coming, and this is their way of sidestepping the litigation. I
Yes.
don't think it really has anything to do with quality control or quality management.
No.
In that respect.
So, I mean, that's pretty disappointing then. I mean, you get them to sign that, and that seems to sign away a lot of things. So the issue for universities is actually, what about the organisational effectiveness? You can put the prices up. In fact, they're going to treble. And next year, the new intake that we take in September, October in Sheffield Hallam, the undergraduates will be paying 3 times as much, 3,000 a year. Now, that's a pretty big hike. I mean, postgraduate fees are set really by what the market can actually take. So that's really an illustration of how the customer relationship is getting increasingly complex. Now, I put a question at the bottom, what about the planet? I mean, another article in the paper, this is very topical, James Lovelock, written stuff on Gaia. But, you know, it was a couple of days after, everyone was saying, you know, the ice sheet's going to melt in Greenland, and what's that going to do to sea level? I mean, you're going to be in business in 20 years' time in senior positions where you might be facing up to the threat of major flooding around the coast of the UK. And what about if you work in central London? Have you seen how high the Thames comes on a spring tide? You know, another 10 feet, and a large part of central London will be gone. So a way of working then that actually achieves balanced stakeholder satisfaction. I've been showing that chart. I first saw that shown in 1988 by our National Quality Director, put that up in front of a lot of hairy head postmasters. I was going to use another word, but decided not to, in deference of colleagues. But, you know, that is the sort of organisational change that we tried to bring about, from control-oriented and internally focused to one that was customer-focused and supportive. Now, this is very, very simplistic, but it's actually quite difficult to do. I mean, who works in an organisation that actually systematically measures customer satisfaction? Is that, how many work in organisations like that? Assuming you work. Some of you don't work. some of you full-time students. Well, do you know whether the university measures customer satisfaction? Yeah. Do you see the results? Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Well, there's a few questions to ask around here, actually. You probably survey your course. You might even be asked to feedback on me. But what about your satisfaction with the general provision of services here, about accommodation, about the standards of cleanliness, the standards of cleaning, and so on? Well, you know, it's not done in many universities. I mean, Durham is, one of the oldest universities. One of its colleges actually founded the first college in Oxford. And they still haven't done a customer survey, even though I've been working with them for about 6 years, because it's darn difficult to get them to agree to do it. What about staff feedback, employee feedback? Who works in organisations that actually do staff feedback? Not many hands are going up. Or there's some going up. Yeah, do you know what they do with it in your organisation? Staff feedback. Do they use it? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Thus spoke the cynic. Yes. Yes, well, that's what tends to happen. I mean, at least our Vice-Chancellor came in, and one of the things she said, we're going to measure student satisfaction every year, staff satisfaction every 2 years, and we'll take note of it and we'll change. The most difficult bit of feedback was actually the staff satisfaction. After the first survey, I think everyone went into denial, because there are big areas of dissatisfaction about the effectiveness of the leadership of the Vice-Chancellor's group. And they all went to ground for about 2 years, I think. But we're doing something about it now, because we're doing things like leadership development, and we did a whole range of improvements in terms of the provision of services to students. So this is one of the first things that if you're going to do stuff which is going to change and improve organisations, it's not a bad idea to listen to the feedback of the customers. Deming used to call it listening to the voice of the process and listening to the voice of the customer. But what about the planet? Who's going to actually look at and be concerned? What about the impact of the organisation is actually having on the local community, on the provision of scarce resources within that local community, on the country, on the globe, sort of thing? And it's about time, I think, that organisations started facing up to the fact that they've got much wider responsibilities than just making profit. You've got to do that, but you've got to do other stuff as well. This is coming back to quality as a proxy for excellence. This is an interesting chart because it actually shows the sorts of things that you have to do just to make sure the customer isn't dissatisfied. You know, the must-be quality is the bottom chart, and it quickly tails off, and this is what is expected. So I don't know what your expectations are of the quality in Bradford University or my students in the context of Sheffield Hallam, but what would actually thrill you and take you to the other curve, you know, the unexpected. Have you had any unexpected stuff here? These are all very difficult questions, I know. I mean, has anything delighted you about the quality of Bradford? What delight? No, has anything delighted you? Well, that's, you see, nothing at all. Yeah. Right, the business game, yeah. Don't you get delighted by all this stuff? Yeah. Well, I went to a university in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Stout, that had won the first university in the US to win the Malcolm Baldrige Prize. And I went there. I mean, one of the things that I noticed is the whole campus is wireless enabled. And on the first day, the students get a laptop. And if it goes wrong, they take it into a sort of repair place. And it's always repaired within 20 minutes, because all they do is they take the hard disk out and give them another computer and put their hard disk in, and it just sort of boots up as though there's been no change. Now, I reckon, you know, if my sons had gone to university and they'd been given a laptop on the first day, they might have been actually quite thrilled by that, and there would be different perceptions. And you might find that that has an impact on the number of students that actually go to that university. So, you know, again, if you're working in organisations that are delivering even a service, I mean, what would delight you as a patient in a hospital? To be treated fairly and nicely with good food. I mean, is that expected or is that delight? I mean, it shows where the standards might be. So these are the things you can start asking yourself in tutorials, and of yourself, how do you actually get to that top curve? The trouble is, it doesn't last for long. because there's this thing called happiness. Again, this is topical because this was just reported in the paper in the last couple of days. I believe in keeping these presentations up to date. I don't know what your earnings expectations are, but I always felt MBA students in particular had this target of actually earning more than 50,000, more than 100,000 pounds a year. Well, actually, whatever you earn, it doesn't necessarily make you happy. It's actually, even Bill Gates of Microsoft says that he's got zillions of money, but it's experiences that actually satisfy him more than the cash. So you've got to just beware of it's called the hedonic treadmill, always trying to get more and more cash, more and more money, because constantly striving apparently stops you being happier. Now, I don't know about the bottom fact, and this is written up by this chap, James Montier. Trainee teachers are likely to be happier than business students. Cool, you're all business students. You're going to switch career now? Or depends whether you want happiness or whether you want money. These are considerations then. If you go back to this chart, where are you on these sorts of curves? Where are the products that your companies are selling or they could sell in the future? And what do you think the... Yes, so on the x-axis, a particular feature of the product or service is available or not available. And the y-axis is the transition from very dissatisfied to very satisfied. Is that okay? It's the availability of a particular feature of the product. So these things here, if they're not available, then people are going to get very dissatisfied. But the availability of something which is expected simply just tails off. So you don't get any more dissatisfied, but you only actually get enhanced satisfaction when other features actually come in, other gizmos. So every car now has air conditioning largely. But what's the difference between a Ford Focus and a Lexus? Both do the same sort of job. But somebody who owns a Lexus would probably be quite thrilled for it. But how long for? They might clean it for the first few weeks, but then 6 months in, probably looking for the next design. It's already out of date. Yeah, actually, that's Stafford Beer, who did a lot of stuff in systems thinking. Absolutum obsoletum. If it works, it's out of date. So what about this thing called the planet? So in setting the context for sustainable excellence, let's just have a look at what sustainability might be. I mean, how long can the planet actually continue providing the scarce resources that your organizations will actually need in the future? So sustainable development, which is, I suppose, a link to sustainable excellence, is defined, this is one definition, to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is starting to suggest that organizations, when they start making decisions, need to make decisions on a value which is actually about future generations. Now, I wonder how many are. I wonder what sort of decisions were made in Enron. Were they about future generations? What decisions, could I ask myself, were made in the post office about future generations? We were about survival. It was the government on our backs. They wanted to privatize us in the mid-90s, and we had to actually increase profit to the detriment of our staff and probably to the detriment of our customers. And then even the Prime Minister gets involved. And in this recent report, which is saying that there is a major issue with climate control, greenhouse gases, and the melting of some, like the likes of the Greenland ice sheets, is, the emission of greenhouse gases is causing global warming at a rate that is unsustainable. Now, what is that going to mean for the organizations you work in 10, 15 years' time? Now, these are really important. This is, you can do your MBA, pass it, but have an eye on this because it's worth doing a bit of future thinking on this. The thing that is perhaps not so familiar to members of the public is this notion that we could come to a tipping point where change could be irreversible. There's a really good book called The Tipping Point. I haven't referenced it. Can't remember the author, but it's a paperback. It's worth picking up. Anybody read it? Yes, yeah. Well, it's a good one to actually have a look at as background reading for this sort of stuff. And tipping point occurs in a number of other phenomena. what's the tipping point that actually persuaded most organisations to do something on quality? What's the tipping point that persuaded organisations in the public sector to go into using the excellence model? And another sort of challenge here, a great change in our stewardship of the earth and the life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated. So when you read books on financial management and you do the finance bit of this, it's okay, but just bear in mind that in terms of stakeholders, society, community is an important one, and how do you factor that into a balance sheet? And now, don't expect me to know the answers. I'm just posing these. If you can do this from this position, pose you the questions. So, how about then trying to look at the world through a different perspective, through 4 lenses, instead of maybe one about performance management processes and so on. And so these 4 quadrants, Johari windows probably is a technical term, but 4 quadrants is the sort of very simple basis of integral thinking that we're trying to develop, I suppose, a way of working with organisations on. Because it starts off by saying the organisations actually are comprised of uniqueness. Every individual in an organisation is individually unique, as a snowflake is. And these unique individuals in our organisations have values, they have attitudes, they have beliefs. If they're leaders, they have a particular style. They might have different levels of consciousness. I mean, there's levels of consciousness. Some people might not be even conscious that there is a planetary threat just around the corner in 10, 20 years' time. I mean, there are many other threats as well. And what about these drivers and worldviews? I mean, you're going to be incredibly privileged doing the MBA because you'll have a significant range of potential regarding world views, and you'll have your own enhancements to your own skills, your own knowledge, your own capabilities. But when you actually go into organisations and you start doing stuff, because it's all about behaviour, if you're doing any psychology in this programme, it's down to what you do, individual actions and behaviours. Personal behaviours in the way you lead your people, the way you relate to the staff that you've got under you. Leadership behaviours, the way you set direction, create an empowering vision and so on. The role, authority and modes of decision making. So the decisions you make, to what extent are they going to reflect your own values or the values of the organisation? Then if you take that and each of these individuals ends up in a collective, it could be a classroom, it could be a faculty, it could be a department, it could be another, or it could be a mail order company. What happens then? And you've got the complexity that exists, it's the culture. But within that culture, what about things like shared vision, shared values, organisational beliefs, relationships? What are the relationships like? Competitive or are they cooperative? And what are the group drivers and worldviews? You know, how worldly is the organisation that you actually work with? Because this is the stuff that it does. And this is the majority of the focus, say, of an MBA programme. It's on things like strategies, policies, processes, systems, performance measures. In marketing, it'll be the brand. But rather than just look at the world from the bottom right quadrant, what we're trying to do is to actually look at the world through those other 3 as well. So that's a model which is in the background until I begin to bring it together towards the end of the presentation. How are we doing so far? Bit of in-process feedback. Is this going all right? Great. Go on. Quite a long way through, aren't I? Yeah. Okay. So if you then look at what makes for successful organisations, then these are some of the critical success factors. It comes from a variety of sources. Collins and Porras, de Gois, Fitzentz, summarised in a book by Barrett, which is referenced here, Liberating the Corporate Soul. Strong, positive, values-driven culture, a commitment to learning and self-renewal. This continual adaptation using internal and external feedback, surveys, both looking at how the internal customers, the staff, feel about the place, but also the external customers. Strategic alliances, partnering. And one of the key things which I've learned in complex organisations like universities, like the post office, is, you know, these silos that where it all breaks down is there's little cooperation across. So the more cooperation you can instill within an organisation, the better it's going to be, because the process is cut across the organisation and they obviously go upstream and downstream outside the organisation. Risk-taking and a process orientation, pretty important to actually understand what the key critical processes of an organisation are. And then a balanced approach, like the balanced stakeholder satisfaction, to measurement. So you don't just measure on profit, you don't just measure on profit efficiency and effectiveness, but you look at things like how you collaborate with suppliers and customers, some measurement around continuous learning, organisational cohesion, and the corporate contribution to the local community and society. So you could almost hold this list up and say, how does the organisation that I know best do all of that? You could hold this up to this university, my university. Where are our strengths and where are my areas for improvement? So it starts to introduce this concept of self-reflection, self-assessment, that is at the heart of what I've been doing with the excellence model. But you could do it with this list. You could say, how well do we do on all of this? And which are the critical areas that we would wish to improve on? So it takes you into the excellence model, and this is going to be helpful for you, because I'm not going to go into it in great detail, but it is the stuff of one of your assignments to look at these so-called 8 fundamental concepts of excellence, because you've got those critical success factors, and you've got that sort of background of the European perspective from the EFQM film, and my sort of scare stories about the planet's going to run out of oil and, you know, we're all going to drown. It's a bit scary, isn't it? But the fundamental concepts, bringing it back to reality, first of all, have focus on the customer collaboration, defining who the customer is, measuring the voice of the customer through surveys and that sort of thing. A wider results orientation, looking at balanced stakeholder feedback, but results oriented nevertheless, because it's useful to achieve some goals, but not at the expense of others. Leadership constancy of purpose, providing that vision and direction, and when times are tough and you've got some big risk that's suddenly come to a head, you know, do you actually maintain the values? Do you maintain the leadership style, or do you go into threat-centered management? You remember that chart I showed from control-oriented, internally focused to the other one? We used to joke about, well, we're trying to get to the other side, but every time we have a crisis, people come running back. And that's the danger. It's important to keep constancy of purpose. Recognizing the importance of the people, you know, people the greatest asset, you read in all the books, but involving them as well at all levels in improving whatever they can be empowered to improve, their bit of the process, training and development. Management by processes and facts. You know, a critical success factor is that organizations have a process and process orientation, but what does that mean in practice? And, you know, we've been 6 years battling with this, and I still don't think our senior management team really understands what management by processes and facts is. Well, you've got a chance to define it in your in your exercise. Partnership development, as I said, is actually developing collaborative partnerships internally and externally. And corporate social responsibility comes in, which has got a pretty shallow definition in the excellence model, which is excellence is exceeding the minimum regulatory framework in which the organisation operates, and to strive to understand and respond to the expectations of their stakeholders in society. That's the EFQM definition of corporate social responsibility. It's obviously a European document, this. It sort of sounds a bit European, that. But what about, you know, scarce resources? What about working with local communities? What about sharing knowledge from a large organisation into a little primary school? That's also part of corporate social responsibility. And finally, continuous learning, innovation, and improvement, which, as I suppose, is pretty central to the whole ethos of total quality management, and organisational excellence. So these are the 8 fundamental concepts, and if you do the research to some of the MSc programme people that are doing TQM, you will know that they pretty well match the principles of total quality management. So, you know, this is from the body of knowledge that says also that these are some characteristics of what successful organisations should pay attention to. Now, the opportunity that we do when we work with our clients in my little centre is to get these words defined in their own context. So this says that corporate social responsibility is the headline, and you get a pretty jargony definition in the excellence model, but what does it mean for my organisation, your organisation? Choose an organisation and say, what would corporate social responsibility really mean for a university? What would it mean for a school, a hospital, or a mail order firm, or a drug company? And say, define, so you could define all those in the context of a type of organisation. And the differences could be public sector, private sector, but they could be voluntary sector as well. I mean, my wife works in the voluntary sector in a social enterprise, but she's defined all of these, or could define all of these, in the context of her type of organisation. Now, you might say, well, are there any others, fundamental concepts, that are missing? Without looking at the next slide, has anybody got any ideas what could be missing from that list? Because if these are fundamental, then they've got to be fundamental. Can't suddenly add one, because it's no longer fundamental. Stands. Sorry? What? Suppliers. Well, that might come in partnership development. Sorry? Vision. Probably leadership and constancy of purpose. I've had communication. Communication, probably people involvement. Well, when we looked at the States and the Baldrige, you find that their fundamental concepts include agility and future focus, although future focus might be a leadership sort of thing. And innovation is being picked out. The EFQM have been reviewing these with a view to enhancing them. And I think agility, innovation, and future focus could be 3 additional type of words which would be chosen. So agility, the ability to be able to change quickly to changing market circumstances, as that video implied. Future focus is having this sight of not just the next year, and are we going to make a profit next year, but 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, doing the sorts of scenario planning that Shell used to do in the 80s and the 90s. And innovation is about constantly innovating, improving your processes, looking for new products and services, but looking at ways in which they are sustainable. So can I just show of hands, who's come across the excellence model? So there's 1 or 2 hands, but not everyone. So is it okay? I'll just quickly describe it. But you can probably get hold of a copy of the excellence model definition. I'm sure it's somewhere in the centre. This is a version that we've produced for higher education. I mean, if anyone's really interested in this, then perhaps they pass your name to Neelam. I might be able to send a few copies in. We're running a bit low on supplies. We've had a problem. We can only give this away. We can't sell it because of copyright restrictions from the EFQM. But the excellence model picks up on those 8 fundamental concepts and probably implies future focus, but not agility. And it has 9 criteria, and those criteria are unpacked and are defined in this sort of document. Now, my job when I worked in EFQM was to develop the public sector version of this. That was then changed further in 2003. My colleague Carol Steed, working with me, developed this version for higher education. So that's an interesting principle, that this model is capable of adaptation, almost morphing into the languages of different types of organisation. So you've got, from results orientation, you've got key performance results from customer focus, you've got customer results, results orientation, you've got people and society results, processes and facts. At the centre of this model is the implication that an organisation knows how to manage its processes. Leadership and constancy of purpose, but the setting up of a management system to manage processes and so on. Policy and strategy, the whole thing, from environmental scanning, development of different plans, corporate plans, strategic plans, business plans, annual operating plans, and the dissemination of those plans by communication. People, from the whole set of, from recruitment, training and development, communication, empowering, nurturing. partnerships and resources, the resources being the physical resources, the money, the buildings, the technology, and so on. So these 9 criteria unpack, and they simply ask questions. The questions were based on knowledge coming out of Europe. So they're sort of really expert-type questions. If answered properly, give a clear indication of where you're already good at doing something, where you can improve. And interestingly, it's all joined up. So the lines imply there's connections, cause and effect connections, not necessarily direct, between, say, people and people results, leadership people and people results. But what about the service profit chain connection between people results, customer results, and the bottom line in key performance results? One of the properties of this model is it contains a number of these other management models. I'll cover the balanced scorecard, but it also covers the service profit chain. Have you heard of the service profit chain? Worth having a look at, actually, and it's referenced in the references in the slide notes. So you've got things that got a technical name of enablers. They're how you do things, and this is what's achieved. And the innovation and learning comes back because you hold this mirror up and you say, how am I doing against this? And this is what we've been doing in my university, and the facilities directorate is the furthest ahead at using this. It's been using this for 6 years, and it is knocking on the doors of becoming European class. It's up there in the leaders at European level. The other principle here is from, I suppose, complexity, is that everything connects to everything. So one of the things which is implied in this is this sort of strategic deployment. You've got a grand vision as leaders, but how do you actually get the people to do it and actually achieve results? And you need this sort of alignment. And there's a whole body of knowledge which is behind this, which is incorporated really into the balanced scorecard approach, which is called Hoshin planning. And everyone's really interested in this. There's a book on Hoshin planning by a guy called Bob King, and it's available from Gold QPC. And that's the balanced scorecard. Have you done that yet? Are you doing it? Actually, what are you doing on your MBA then? Is this your first? Isn't it your first? Cool. This is all. I'm not sure. I mean, do they do the balanced scorecard? Cool. You've got to do it sometime. Well, it's worth having a look at because a significant number of organisations in the UK are using this as a way of managing performance management. And it has 4 perspectives, which you can see map onto the excellence model. The first one, financial perspective, how do we look to shareholders? How do we look to our customers? How good are our processes? And how are we continuing to improve and create value? Well, the interesting thing about this is that it's actually very close to the excellence model. So trying to pull this together, because one of the things that you hear in government is about joined up government. Well, what we really need is joined up organisations, and it's making these connections. So, what are the values? How do you develop the values in an organisation? How do you, from the values, develop the mission and the vision? How do you develop the core strategies, the scorecards, and so on? Because it's from what we believe in to actually what we deliver, because the delivery is these goals and outcomes, satisfied stakeholders, proud employees, delighted customers, and enhanced communities. So, these are models which are, what you have to see is the interrelatedness of them. The excellence model provides a self-assessment framework, but the things that you have to do to get through it all are to actually consider each of those lines. The development of a set of values, mission, vision, and so on. And this is the link with excellence model, customers and financial key performance links to measures and outcomes, internal processes and organisational development, links to other results areas and the enablers. So what I'm really showing here is, I thought you probably covered the balanced scorecard, but the excellence model includes the basis of the balanced scorecard and the service profit chain. So self-assessment, as I said, when you hold this up, is you've got a model of excellence and it asks a lot of questions. You start to get evidence on the questions, you identify the strengths, the areas for improvement, the score and the action plan. So it's a bit like an exam. It's a bit like doing your essays. You know, you've got an assessment and the tutor will, our colleague, say your name again? You're going to be marking these? Yes. So, you know, we're going to have good things that you did in your assessment, areas for improvement. You're going to have a mark. I suppose the action plan is what do you do on your next assessment if you want to get a really good mark and get a distinction. I mean, it's worth working for it, but you actually get feedback. So this is about how do you get organisations that go through that process of self-reflection and end up getting distinctions. Well, the distinctions is they win European Quality Awards, and there's a whole process in Europe to enable companies to do that. But introduces another thing, is that come across this, the sigmoid curve. One of the things to consider is where on this curve is the excellence model. You know, is it reaching sort of market saturation, or is it down the other side, or is it down here? I mean, would anyone like to take a view?
What is the sigmoid curve?
Well, the sigmoid curve has its origins in, I'm not sure actually, is it something to do with Pareto? No, but it was featured in Charles Handy's book, The Empty Raincoat, and it has a particular property because what Charles Handy says in that is at that point, it's a product life cycle curve. That might be its other name. It is as you're going up here, you know, you're selling more and more widgets, but suddenly somebody's coming into the market with a widget Mark II. And, you know, it doesn't sell many, but it takes off. And widget Mark I comes down the other side. Product life cycle curve is probably the better one to call it. So EFQM could be a particular management practice which is somewhere up there. I think it's gone over the other side, actually. So one of the things that we're looking at in our centre is, you know, that implies what's next. Because the number of members of EFQM are actually dropping at the moment.
What
So,
is next? This curve implies that there is something else that's
yeah,
followed the
yeah.
EFQM model.
Well, you see, if you don't find that, then you die. So there must be products that you could think of where people never saw it and it drops off. I'm trying to think of an example. Can't think one off the top of my head.
You're talking about the EFQM model?
Well, I'm talking about the FQM model as being like a product. Where is it on the product life cycle?
But if you said it's dropped off the back, it implies that something else.
Something is coming, yeah.
Something else is, it's taken over.
Well, maybe I'm seeing that we're seeing that it could do that, and you know we're actually.
Six Sigma then.
Well, it could be. So I mean, if you look at Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, big users of the excellence model, they don't use it anymore. They actually use lean thinking. Interestingly, so Six Sigma is taking over maybe lean or Lean Six Sigma, yeah. Okay, so this is self-assessment. So that's one of the primary uses of the so-called excellence model. And in terms of sustaining excellence, you know, it's not only this, but how is your excellence journey going? Are you able to keep on track? And, you know, would you be able to spot that the organisation, from a sustainability point of view, is going over the top? There's a guy called Adizes, has an Adizes Centre in California that uses a similar approach to product life cycle. I've had some feedback that after my talk you want a bit of a break. So I'm pleased to say that you're going to get a 10-minute sort of stand-up walk around at the end of my talk. Shouldn't be too long now. Okay, so one of the key learning points from the work that I've done, Royal Mail, working in EFQM, working with the Cabinet Office, was that, you know, a lot of organisations are heavily hierarchical, but actually that you've got to start getting into process thinking. So these are some of the considerations of the organisational change that's needed if you're going to get sustainability in terms of improvement. You don't get very far if you don't tackle processes and understand what the processes are and manage them coherently. So really, one of the themes of the work we're doing is integrating for excellence. It's about integrating all of that. So one of the things you can do, again, in the context of best practice management, when we were looking, part of our university project, at how good organisations manage processes, these are some of the examples of how they do it. So, it's just a search. How does a good organisation develop its good communication strategy? What sort of features does communication strategy have? This happens to be an example of how organisations manage processes. So it's in the slide notes. I won't read each of these out individually. And when we put together all the learning from our work with universities, this is just with universities, if you cross the university out and put organisation, that's pretty much what any organisation would find if it holds this excellence model up and says, where could we improve? Those are normally the areas of improvement where organisations need to search for good practice. And one of the ways they do it actually is by benchmarking. And of course this centre is one of the leading exponents of benchmarking globally, I would say. So again, putting it in perspective, the excellence model picks up on all of those. That's some that I've posted around the model to show that, if you do it systematically and conscientiously, then the excellence model can lead organisations to become really excellent. Now, you might say, well, prove it. And in the slide notes, I put some slides. It's probably best not to go through, but the study that was done at the University of Leicester on behalf of EFQM and the British Quality Foundation showed that in a sample of organisations, they took public available information from accounts. This is sort of the methodology, share value, accounting-based measures. And they looked at 120 award-winning companies over an 11-year period. And the conclusion of this is the excellence model works. And there are some slides that follow, which I could track through, but I think I'll pick up on this last one. 5-year improvements in financial performance after the first award. This is what has happened. So that is actually fairly good evidence to suggest that the excellence model works. But it's not the excellence model. The excellence model actually only asks a lot of questions. It's what the organisations do in response to finding out that they've got something that they could improve. So they have to go and search for best practice in all the areas that I've mentioned. So this is a framework. It's an empty shell of ideas. The organisations have to find it to do that. And that needs leadership and constancy of purpose and going into all the areas of the fundamental concepts and really becoming excellent in all the 9 criteria of the excellence model, including the impact on society. So, it's definitely about all of that, coming back to my 4 quadrants. And there's a whole lot you can go at. And in terms of the excellence journey, this is the sort of direction that you can go. And I suppose the organisations I'm working with in this sector are, up about the middle. But I'm working with another one in Sheffield that's into using it as a strategic tool. They provide services, outsourcing services for the DTI, Department of Trade and Industry. And the DTI insisted that they engage with the excellence model, and they've actually now embracing all that material on the right, and that is sort of best practice. So back to this thing, what's next? Is there a next on all of this? Because if you go back in history and look at total quality management and where it's come from, some of this stuff, no doubt, you're going to cover on your MBA. Scientific management, Taylorism, the Ford car, just one colour. Deming, 14 points, the emphasis on the customer, the theory of profound knowledge. Duran Crosby Peters, and there's a good book by Mohammed just written on Duran and Deming. Is that available to them? Yeah, that's available from the centre. 1987-88, the Baldrige model came out. EFQM was actually founded in 1988. And business and organizational excellence. Well, you know, what is next? We're starting, you know, Six Sigma, Lean. Well, Six Sigma was around in the late 80s. Motorola developed it as a way of enhancing the performance of their manufacturing process. You know, it's been made into, you know, something like EFQM. You know, you can get brown belts and black belts in terms of your experience of facilitating Six Sigma changes. Yeah.
But Six Sigma, there's not really any difference between that and TQM. It's just another name for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's a focus on improving the effectiveness of the core process, mainly manufacturing process. The Six Sigma relates to the number of failures that you get, the number of errors and so on, where it's only three parts in a million. But TQM didn't often take processes to that fine degree of operation. Yes, it's an. Yes, that's the yes, yeah. So it is an enhancement, but it uses. You're right. I think the same principles of TQM, statistical process control, is just taken the error limits much broader. So it's three parts in a million, 3.4. So you know, and when we were addressing this at a meeting we had in of the community of practice, the EFQM Education Community of Practice in Erasmus University back in October, Professor Tonha Jono, who was one of the founding fathers of the excellence model, sort of showed this chart. And we asked him what the essence was. And he came up with these three words: spirituality, aesthetics, and values. Cool. I mean, you probably think, you know, talking about the planet and scarce resources, I'm now using a word beginning with S, spirituality. What does that mean? And we have a research student in Sheffield looking at spirituality in the workplace. And values is what I'm now engaged with. And I'm finding that I'm almost going around another cycle. Having used the excellence model to get up there, I'm now using a values-based approach to transformation. Because that seems to be having as much, if not more, impact, because there seems to be a need for this sort of stuff. And we're using an approach, really, that gets into this left-hand quadrant of this so-called all-quadrant model. And it comes in and starts to work with things like the development of a shared vision, you know, starts to embrace things like ethics, and certainly looks at collective beliefs and values. So what we're beginning to do is the two-sided approach, not just the excellence model with the emphasis on the hard stuff, but the soft stuff as well. And no doubt you'll be doing that as part of your MBA, because it's coming back to this point of the critical success factors for organizations is the development of a strong, positive, values-driven culture. I'm going to bypass a bit because I'm running out of time. And my apologies, but I think you can read the rest. What I wanted to do then to say is I've taken you really through looking at some aspects of the bottom right quadrant here. In terms of the development of the culture, the work that we're doing on values is beginning to address that. And the work we're doing to develop things like leadership, and we're using 360-degree feedback on some of our managers in Sheffield Hallam, is actually taking us into the top two quadrants. We have then an approach which is a four-quadrant approach. And I think it picks up on these sorts of things. ISO, Investors in People, the Balanced Scorecard, Lean Thinking, and Six Sigma. But it's much broader than that because it takes into account sort of values. The other connection that we're making in Sheffield Hallam is how it links through to our brand values, which is about employability, supportive and forward thinking. So in Sheffield Hallam, we wish to create an environment, a supportive, forward thinking environment, which means that our students are fully employable. One of the things that we've learnt is that we need these sorts of alignments. Personal alignment, that's walking the talk, and values alignment, structural alignment. So it's about creating group cohesion, but also enhanced mission performance under any operating circumstance. So it brings into mind the issue of resilience. So, I mean, the question back to you is, are you about, as your students, as you progress into doing these fantastic jobs in the future, creating a sustainable civilization? A question for you. I think this might have been taken at the time the floods were approaching New Orleans. The thought is that this from T.S. Eliot, we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. And finally, something which was shown to me on an overhead projector slide in a school canteen in Pennsylvania by a guy called Joel Barker. He put this up. It was a conference for teachers developing a new curriculum. Vision without action is simply dreaming. Action without vision is merely activity. Vision with action, you can change the world. So I come to the end of my slides. This isn't the end of the evening. I think we should take a break now, but it's been great to be given the privilege to talk to you tonight. I hope I've given you some few thoughts to stimulate you in your discussions later on this evening and in your dissertations. Thanks very much for the invitation.